The coat was 2 sizes too big. Maria Delgado had found it at the Goodwill on West 47th Street the previous November, stuffed in a bin between a broken lamp and a denim jacket with a missing button. She'd paid $3 for it, a men's peacoat, charcoal gray, with a fraying hem and a pocket that no longer closed all the way. She'd taken it home, washed it twice, and sewn the pocket shut with brown thread because she didn't have black. Then she'd given it to her son, Tomas, who was 9 years old and had never once complained about anything in his entire life. That was the part that broke her the most. Not the poverty, not the cold apartment on the 6th floor of a building in the South Bronx where the radiator clanked like it was being beaten from the inside and sometimes stopped altogether in January. Not the 2 jobs, the diner on Jerome Avenue where she worked the breakfast shift from 5 to 11 in the morning, and the laundromat 2 blocks east where she worked from noon to 8, folding other people's warm clothes while her own sat in a hamper waiting. Not the loneliness that came at night, that specific and suffocating loneliness of being the only adult in a home, of being the person who had to make every decision alone, who had to cry alone and pray alone and figure it out alone. Not even the memory of her husband, Danny, who had died 22 months ago on a Tuesday in February when a delivery truck ran a red light on the Cross Bronx Expressway and hit his car on the driver's side, killing him at 34 years old, leaving her with 2 kids, $1,200 in a joint checking account, and a wound in her chest that had never once stopped bleeding. None of that was what broke her. What broke her was that Tomas never complained. He never said the coat was ugly or too big, or that the kids at school laughed. He never told her he was hungry on the nights when she stretched a box of pasta with butter into 2 dinners and called it fine. He never cried in front of her. He was 9 years old, and he had learned, somehow, in the way that children of suffering learn, to make himself smaller so that her burden would be lighter. And that silent, enormous, unasked-for gift from a child who should have been asking for video games and birthday cakes, was the thing that cracked her open on a regular basis. His sister, Lily, was 6. She was different from Tomas in the way that spring is different from winter, louder, warmer, less guarded, still young enough to believe that things would simply be okay because they had been okay before. She drew pictures at the kitchen table and taped them to the wall above the radiator. She sang songs she learned at school with total unself-conscious joy. She called for Maria in the night when she had bad dreams, and Maria always came. Always, no matter how many hours she'd worked or how badly her feet hurt from standing on cracked linoleum floors. On the morning that everything began to change, it was the first Saturday in March. Maria had gotten up at 4:30, as she always did on Saturdays, to make lunches for the week. She'd been cutting carrots in the kitchen, small, precise cuts, the way her mother had taught her, nothing wasted, when Tomas appeared in the doorway of the kitchen in his pajamas, the ones with the faded rocket ships on them, holding his shoes. "The sole is coming off again," he said. She looked at the shoe. The front sole was peeling away from the toe, gaping open like a small mouth. "I can fix it," she said. "I know," he said, and he sat down at the kitchen table and watched her cut carrots, and neither of them said anything else about it. That was how they communicated, the 2 of them, in the negative space around the hard thing, in the agreement not to make each other feel worse. She fixed the shoe with superglue at 5 in the morning, pressing the sole back into place and holding it with a rubber band from the junk drawer while it dried. Then she made oatmeal and cut a banana into it, they had 1 banana left, and divided it between 2 bowls, and left a covered plate for Lily, who was still sleeping, and went to work. The diner was called Rosie's, though no one named Rosie had owned it for 30 years. It occupied a corner spot on Jerome Avenue, under the elevated tracks of the 4 train, and every 20 minutes or so the whole building shuddered as a train roared overhead, and the coffee cups rattled in their saucers, and conversation paused automatically and then resumed. Maria had worked there for 14 months. She wore a uniform that was slightly too tight in the shoulders, and she carried a notepad in her apron pocket, even though she rarely needed it because she had the regulars' orders memorized down to how much milk they wanted in their coffee. She was good at her job. She was fast and careful, and she smiled even on the days when smiling cost her something. She knew the names of her customers' children and their dogs and their problems, and she remembered, and people liked her for the remembering. It made them feel seen. It was, she understood, an irony she didn't have much energy to dwell on. She spent her days making other people feel seen, while she herself moved through the world increasingly. The cough had started on a Thursday. Lily came home from school with red cheeks and a small, persistent bark of a cough that Maria assumed was a cold. She made her chamomile tea with honey and had her sleep with an extra blanket, and checked her temperature twice in the night, 99.4, not high enough for the emergency room, high enough for worry. By Sunday, it was still there. By the following Thursday, 11 days later, it was worse. Not dramatically worse, but worse in the quiet, accumulating way of things that are trying to tell you something. Dr. Patricia Shaw had been Lily and Tomas's pediatrician since they were born. Her office was on the third floor of a building on Grand Concourse, and she'd worked with families on sliding scale fees for 20 years, and she was one of those people who are simply, inexplicably, genuinely good. The kind of doctor who crouched down to be at eye level with a child, who remembered not just the medical history, but the child's favorite color and the name of their stuffed animal. Maria had avoided calling the office for 10 days because the copay was $60, and she'd been waiting to see if it would resolve on its own, which was the calculus of the uninsured and underinsured, the constant negotiation between what the body needs and what the bank account allows. But on Saturday night, after the diner, after the couple who'd asked for a different server and left no tip, she lay in the dark listening to Lily cough from the other room and decided that $60 was $60 and not her daughter's health. She called Monday morning. Dr. Shaw saw Lily at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. Maria took the afternoon off from the laundromat, unpaid, and held Lily's hand on the bus. And Lily, who was in a good mood as she often was when something was being done about a thing that was bothering her, sang a song about frogs to herself and kicked her feet against the bus seat in time. Dr. Shaw listened to Lily's chest for a long time. Then she said, calmly, the way she said all things, "I want to send her for a chest X-ray." "Okay," Maria said. "There's some unusual breath sounds on the left side that I want to get a better look at. It's probably nothing serious. Children pick up all kinds of things, and these sounds can come from a number of minor conditions, but I want to be sure." "What could it be?" Maria asked. She kept her voice steady. She was good at keeping her voice steady. Dr. Shaw looked at her directly. "I don't want to speculate before we have the imaging. What I will tell you is that I'm not panicking, and I want you not to panic either, but I do want the X-ray done this week." Maria scheduled it for Friday at the hospital across the street from the doctor's office. The hospital accepted Medicaid, which Lily was on, so there would be no cost. This was the one financial mercy. She walked home from the appointment because the bus fare was $2.75 each way, and she needed to preserve what she had. It was 42 blocks. She walked them in the gathering cold of a March afternoon, holding Lily's hand, listening to her daughter chatter about a boy in her class named Marcus who had eaten a crayon, and whether crayons were poisonous. "They're not poisonous." "How do you know?" "I looked it up once." "Why did you look it up?" Maria smiled. "Because when you were 3, you ate a piece of a red crayon." Lily looked horrified and delighted simultaneously. "Did I?" "You did. You said it tasted like a candle." Lily considered this. It probably did taste like a candle. They walked in a comfortable silence for a block, Lily's small hand warm inside hers, and Maria looked up at the gray March sky over the Bronx and thought, as she often did, of Danny. He loved the city, even on its hardest days. He used to say that New York was the only place in America where you could be completely invisible and completely known at the same time. He'd grown up in this neighborhood, knew every block by its smell and sound, and he'd walked these streets with her before they had children, on the nights when they were young and had nothing and were wildly, irrationally happy about it. She missed him with a force that was sometimes physical, a punch under the ribs. The specific grief of a person who has lost the one they talked to about everything, who now has to carry everything alone. The X-ray was Friday. She got the results the following Monday by phone while she was on her break at the laundromat. "Maria?" It was Dr. Shaw. Her voice was careful in a way that it hadn't been before, the voice of a person managing information. "Tell me," Maria said. She walked to the back of the laundromat, past the industrial dryers, to the small storage area where it was quieter. The X-ray showed a small mass in Lily's left lung. I want to be very clear with you that a mass doesn't automatically mean something serious. There are several benign possibilities, particularly in children this age, but we need to get an MRI and a follow-up with a pulmonary specialist to understand what we're looking at. "What could it be?" Maria asked. She kept her voice steady. She was good at keeping her voice steady. Dr. Shaw looked at her directly. "I don't want to speculate before we have the imaging. What I will tell you is that I'm not panicking, and I want you not to panic either, but I do want the X-ray done this week." The MRI was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks after the phone call from Dr. Shaw. In the intervening weeks, Maria had told no one except one person, a woman named Gloria Reyes, who was 58 years old and lived in the apartment directly below theirs and had, for the past year and a half, watched the children after school for $60 a week, which was all Maria could afford and which Gloria had accepted without complaint. Gloria was a Puerto Rican grandmother whose own children were grown and scattered across 3 states, and she had adopted Maria's family with the quiet tenacity of someone who has learned that love is not made from words, but from presence. Maria told her on a Tuesday evening, standing in the hallway between their apartment doors, keeping her voice low so the kids inside wouldn't hear. Gloria listened without interrupting, and when Maria was done, she put her hand on Maria's face, not her shoulder, her face, a gesture of such specific tenderness that Maria nearly came apart, and said, "She's going to be fine. I know it. I feel it here." She pressed her fist to her sternum. "And whatever she needs, whatever you need, I'm here. You understand me. I'm not going anywhere." Maria nodded. "You eating?" Gloria asked. "Yes." "I don't believe you." "I'm eating. I made arroz con pollo. You're coming down tonight." Maria started to decline. Gloria's expression stopped her. "Tonight," Gloria said. "Bring the kids." They went. They ate at Gloria's small table, which was covered in a yellow plastic tablecloth and had a rotating centerpiece of artificial flowers that Lily loved deeply and Tomas regarded with scientific skepticism. Gloria put a plate in front of Maria that was large enough for 2 people and watched her eat with the satisfaction of someone performing a necessary act of love. Lily talked for the entire meal, covering topics from the crayon incident to a documentary about dolphins she'd seen at school to a detailed proposal for a hamster. Tomas ate quietly, and at one point, when Gloria told a story about a neighbor from 40 years ago that made everyone laugh, he looked at his mother and smiled, a full, unguarded smile, not the compressed, careful kind, and Maria reached over and squeezed his hand under the table. He squeezed back. Those were the weeks, she would later think, when she understood most clearly what she had, not what she'd lost, not what she lacked, but what she had. These 2 children, this woman downstairs, this small life assembled from difficulty and stubbornness and love, which was fragile and sufficient, and hers. The incident at the school happened on a Friday, 2 days before the MRI. Lily's school held a spring fundraiser every March, a luncheon for parents held in the cafeteria, which was decorated for the occasion with paper flowers made by the children, and which served sandwiches and pasta salad, and those pink lemonade concentrate drinks that tasted like childhood. It was one of those school events that was technically free to attend, but operated on the understood premise that parents would donate to the school fund, and the understood amounts, communicated through the polite language of the donation envelope that came home with every child, were $50 or more. Maria had $50. Specifically, she had the $50 she had set aside for Lily's spring coat, because Lily had grown 3 inches since last fall, and her current jacket hit above the wrist. She made a decision that Lily would need the coat before the school would need the $50, and she sent back the envelope with a handwritten note explaining that she was happy to contribute her time to help with setup or cleanup if that would be of use. Lily had been asking about the luncheon for 2 weeks. Maria had promised she would come. She arranged her shifts, skipping the laundromat that Friday to attend, and arrived at noon in the clothes she reserved for things that mattered: dark slacks, a cream-colored blouse, her good shoes, which were only good in a relative sense, but were clean and unscuffed. She had her hair down, which she rarely did because it took time to manage, but Lily had specifically requested it. "You look the prettiest with your hair down, Mama," she'd said, and Maria had thought, "For you then, for you." The cafeteria was crowded and warm and bright with the crepe paper flowers the first graders had made. Maria found Lily immediately because Lily found her, came running across the room with her arms open, launching herself at her mother with the absolute physical confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt the arms that would catch her. "You came," Lily said, as if this were a surprise, which broke Maria's heart slightly. "I told you I was coming, baby." "I know, but you came in person." She held her and looked over her daughter's shoulder at the cafeteria filling with parents, most of them in work clothes, harried and loving, the ordinary, beautiful mess of parenthood, and felt the particular gladness of having made it, of being here, of being the person Lily ran toward. They found seats at a table near the window. At their table were 2 other mothers, a black woman named Sandra, whose daughter was Lily's best friend, and a Haitian-American woman named Christine, who Maria recognized from drop-off but didn't know well. They ate and talked, and Lily performed for them in the way she always performed when she had an audience, which was with total commitment and absolutely no self-consciousness, and Maria laughed more in that hour. The MRI was at 9 in the morning. Maria had arranged for Gloria to take the kids to school. She had ironed her blouse the night before, which was a habit she'd inherited from her mother, the idea that if you presented yourself with care to difficult things, you brought a certain kind of dignity to them, and dignity was not nothing. She'd sat with Lily the night before at bedtime, and they'd talked about the procedure without calling it what it was. She'd called it a big camera picture, and said it was to help the doctor see everything clearly, and there was nothing scary about it. Lily had said, "Like when you take pictures of me to send to Abuela," and Maria had said, "Exactly like that," which was not even close to accurate, but was emotionally correct. And that had been enough. Tomas, at bedtime, had said only, "I'll take care of Lily until you get back." "I know you will," Maria said. He'd nodded once and gone to sleep. The MRI facility was in a hospital in Fordham, a 20-minute bus ride. Maria sat in the waiting room for an hour before they called Lily's name, and then sat in a smaller waiting room while the machine made its science fiction sounds on the other side of the wall. She held her coffee in both hands and stared at a poster about hand washing, and thought about nothing and everything simultaneously. She thought about the laundromat manager, who'd said she could only take so many mornings off before he needed someone reliable. She thought about the amount in her checking account, which was holding steady at $411. She thought about Danny, who had, in a different life, sat in a different waiting room with her when Tomas was born. pacing and talking too much because he was nervous, making her laugh despite everything. She thought about how much of the last 2 years had been the experience of needing someone in a room with her and there being no one. She thought, I am tired. She thought, I am so tired. The radiologist was a young man named Dr. Abernathy, who had the slightly stunned quality of someone in the middle of a long shift. He sat with her for 10 minutes after the scan and went through the images on a screen, and he was professional and careful, and she appreciated him for not softening what he said or overcomplicating it. The mass was still present. It was small, under 2 centimeters, and its characteristics on the MRI were not consistent with a malignancy, but they would need the pulmonologist to confirm. Dr. Shaw would receive the report within 48 hours and schedule the follow-up. What is the most likely thing it is? Maria asked. He was quiet for a moment. Based on the imaging, I'd say the most likely thing is that it's a benign inflammatory granuloma, essentially the body's response to some previous infection, common in children. If that's what it is, it may resolve on its own or require a simple course of treatment, but I want to be very clear that we need the specialist's assessment before anyone should feel certain about anything. Okay, Maria said. Do you have questions? I have about 1,000 questions, she said, but I don't think any of them can be answered today. He nodded with something that was almost a smile. That's a very reasonable assessment of the situation. She took the bus home. She went directly to the laundromat where she worked the afternoon shift, folding other people's warm clothes with the same focused quietness she brought to everything, and when she got home that evening, Gloria had made soup and left it on the stove, and the kids were at the kitchen table doing homework, and Lily was singing to herself, quietly, some song Maria didn't recognize, and the apartment smelled like chicken and onions and paper and the specific smell that Lily's hair always had, something like honey and something like outside, and Maria stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds before either of them noticed her, just holding the sight of them. You're home, Tomas said. I'm home, she said. That night, after dinner, Maria called her mother in Texas. She sat in the hallway outside the apartment, the stairwell, actually, on the top step, the way she always did when she needed privacy, and her mother answered on the 3rd ring, slightly out of breath, just home from work. Mija, her mother said, and Maria, who had not cried to her mother in 2 years, who had been protecting her mother from the specific weight of it all, said, Mama, I need to tell you something. She told her everything, about Lily, about the cough, the X-ray, the mass, the MRI, the 48 hours of waiting, about the laundromat manager who'd said she could only take so many mornings off before he needed someone reliable, about the amount in her check. The letter arrived in April. It came in a plain envelope with a Texas postmark, and Maria almost threw it away because she didn't recognize the return address, a law firm in Dallas, which she assumed was something to do with a debt or a bureaucratic complication of the kind that was always arriving uninvited. She set it on the kitchen table for 2 days before she opened it, during which time it sat there acquiring the gravity of things left unaddressed. On the 2nd day, after dinner, after the kids were asleep, she opened it. It was 6 pages long. She read it twice. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a very long time without moving. The letter was from an attorney named R. Scott Delaney, representing the estate of one Frank Holloway, deceased, of Dallas, Texas. Frank Holloway had died in January of this year, at the age of 72. He had been, the letter explained, a commercial real estate developer. He had also been, in the winter of 2019, a man in serious trouble. In the winter of 2019, Frank Holloway had been in New York on a business trip, and on a Tuesday night in February, he had collapsed on the sidewalk on West 162nd Street in Washington Heights at 10:30 in the evening with a cardiac event. The street had been largely empty. It was cold and late, and the few people who might have passed simply had not. He had been alone, unable to call for help, his phone in his coat pocket and his hands not responding. He had been found by a man named Daniel Delgado, who had been walking home from a late delivery shift, who had called 911 and stayed with him until the ambulance came, and who had, the letter noted, likely saved his life. At the hospital, Frank Holloway had asked a nurse for the name of the man who had found him, and the nurse had gotten it from the emergency contact form that Daniel Delgado had helpfully filled out. Frank had tried to contact him afterward, had sent a card to the address on file, which was the apartment on the 6th floor of the building in the South Bronx, but had never received a response. He had tried again 6 months later, and again received no response. What he had not known was that Daniel Delgado had died in February of 2022, 3 years after that February night, and that the card had arrived at an address occupied by a widow and 2 small children who had been in no condition to be corresponding with strangers. Frank Holloway had not forgotten. In his will, he had instructed R. Scott Delaney to locate the family of Daniel Delgado of the Bronx, New York, who had saved his life in February 2019. He had left them, the letter said, $400,000. Maria read the page with the number on it 3 times. She set the letter on the table. She looked at the walls of the apartment, the paper flowers Lily had taped above the radiator, the school photos on the refrigerator, the framed picture of her and Danny at Coney Island, the summer before Thomas was born, squinting into the sun and laughing at something just out of frame. She thought about the night Danny had come home late from work in February, 5 years ago, and she had been annoyed because dinner was cold and the baby was fussy and he was 2 hours late and hadn't called. He had sat down at this table and told her, with the slightly dazed quality of a person who has been altered by an experience, about the man he'd found on the sidewalk. He'd described it carefully. The cold, the man's face, the fear of not knowing if he was too late, the relief when the ambulance came. And then, because he was Danny, he had shrugged and said, "What was I going to do? Keep walking?" She had kissed him then, she remembered. She had been holding the baby and she had kissed him on the forehead and said, "No, you couldn't have kept walking." "Neither could anyone," he'd said. "That's not true," she'd said, "but it's true about you." He had never mentioned it again. It was not the kind of thing Danny made into a story. He had found a man in trouble, he had stopped, he had helped, and he had come home and made himself a plate of cold rice and eaten it standing at the counter. That was all. Maria sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean. It didn't mean that Danny's death had been worth it. It didn't mean that the past 2 years had been a test with a reward at the end. It didn't mean anything that tidy or that consoling. Danny was gone, and he would always be gone, and $400,000, which was more money than Maria had seen in her entire life combined, did not change that. But it meant something. It meant that Danny's goodness, that particular and It was Gloria who connected the rest of it, a week later, in the way that Gloria always connected things, not with drama, but with the matter-of-fact precision of a woman who has been paying attention. She was at Maria's table drinking coffee when Maria mentioned the name, Catherine Holloway, the woman at the school lunch. Gloria set her cup down. "What did you say the husband's name was?" she said, "in the letter?" "Frank Holloway." Gloria looked at her with an expression that was impossible to interpret for a full 3 seconds, and then she said, "Mija, I think that woman's husband was the man on the sidewalk." Maria stared at her. They worked through it carefully, the way you work through something improbable that is becoming certain. The name, the timing, the Dallas address on the law firm's letterhead, and Catherine Holloway, who had a Texan's way of holding her vowels that Maria had barely registered. The boy named Bryce, who would have been a boy named Bryce in Dallas before they moved to New York. The woman in the camel coat, who had looked at Maria across a school cafeteria table and made a comment about contributions made in the ways one can. She was the widow of the man whose life Danny had saved. She had sat 3 feet from the woman her husband had tried for years to find. She had looked at Maria and seen a charity case, someone to be managed at a careful distance, someone without a story worth knowing. She had not seen Danny's wife. She had not seen the woman her husband had been trying to thank for 5 years. Maria sat with this for a long time. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated in the petty way the story seemed to invite, the sense that fate had arranged a pointed lesson for Catherine Holloway. She did not feel that. She felt something more complicated, a sadness for the missed connection, for the years of it, for the fact that 2 families had been orbiting the same center of gravity without knowing it, living in the same city and sending their children to the same school, and sitting 3 feet apart at a school lunch while Danny's name hung in the air between them, unspoken. But she also felt, pressing against the sadness, something else. She thought about what Danny had said. What was I going to do? Keep walking? She thought about Catherine Holloway, who had lost her husband in January, who was living now in New York with 2 teenage children and a hole in the center of her life that Maria recognized, that Maria had been living inside for 2 years, that was the exact shape of the person you'd built yourself around. She thought about what it meant to lose the person who found injured strangers on sidewalks at 10:30 at night and stayed with them in the cold. She thought, we are both widows. She thought, she doesn't know yet. 3 days later, Maria wrote a letter. She was not a natural writer of letters. She wrote carefully and then started again twice, trying to find the register that was neither too much nor too little. She ended up with something plain and honest, the way she tried to be in all things. Dear Mrs. Holloway, my name is Maria Delgado. I believe my husband, Daniel, was the person who found your husband on West 162nd Street in February 2019. I've recently received a letter from your husband's attorney, which is how I came to understand the connection between our families. I also believe we met briefly at our school lunch in March. I don't know if you would remember me. I've been thinking about what to say since I made this connection, and I think the simplest thing is the truest. My husband was a good man who could not walk past someone who needed help. He would have been embarrassed by the gift your husband left our family, and also, I think, quietly glad. Not for us, but because it would have meant to him that the man he found was okay. He was always more interested in whether people were okay than in being thanked. I am so sorry for the loss of your husband. I know what it is to lose a good man. I hope your children are well. Sincerely, Maria Delgado. She mailed it on a Thursday. She didn't expect a response, or not a quick one, and she was prepared for no response at all, which would have been its own kind of answer. Catherine Holloway responded in 11 days. The response was 3 pages, handwritten in a script that was careful and slightly unsteady, the handwriting of someone who had been crying while they wrote. She had not known, until Maria's letter, who had been with Frank that night. The hospital had told her only that a passerby had called 911. Frank had told her a man had stayed with him, had held his hand, had talked to him while they waited for the ambulance, had told her, "It's going to be okay, I'm here, stay with me," but they had never been able to make contact. Frank talked about your husband until the day he died, Catherine wrote. He said he had never felt so completely not alone in a moment when he had every reason to be terrified. He said the man who found him had a calm that he thought at the time might be an angel, and then he laughed at himself for thinking that. And then he thought, maybe it doesn't matter what we call it. Some people have something in them. I want to tell you that I am ashamed of the comment I made at the school lunch. I know it cannot be unsaid. I don't know exactly what I meant by it, which is perhaps the most honest and damning admission, that I said something dismissive without thinking, without seeing you as a person. I am trying to understand that about myself. I am not sure I've been as good a person as my husband was, but I am trying. I would like, if you are willing, to know you, not as an obligation, not as an act of reparation, but because our husbands are connected in a way that neither of us chose and neither of us can undo, and because I think Frank would have wanted me to know the woman who raised the man who held his hand. I am also, if I'm honest, very alone since January, and I think you might understand that. Maria read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning, before the kids were up. She read it once, and then sat with it. She thought about what it means to see someone, how easy it is not to, how the world arranges itself, by money and zip code and the quality of your coat, to make not seeing feel natural, even logical, a series of categories that protect you from the discomfort of everyone else's particularity. She thought about how much suffering happens